In a recent video, I said, some players with disabilities may also use a tool like this to allow them to more easily keep up. Personally, I feel like this is around where I draw the line, as it is reaching a point where you're using mods to play the game almost for you. If you have a disability that makes it so that this is the only way you can play, sure, but I also start wondering if, maybe, you would have had more fun doing something else. Not saying you are not welcome here, just saying that there might be a better match for your capabilities. First off, I would like to apologize for sort of making a bit of a joke out of a serious topic like this. This resulted in what I said being taken, to say the least, differently than I had intended, and I definitely also overlooked some problems, so I apologize for this error. That said, modding in a game like Final Fantasy XIV can indeed greatly level the playing field between players with or without disabilities, but it is worth mentioning that there are some potential pain points here, and based on the responses I got on the previous video on the topic of modding, many of them highlighted some important examples of the ways and reasons potentially disabled players are more likely to actually use mods. In a crazy twist, some players might still find these kinds of mods unfair depending on how they view modding as a whole. But let's talk about this. What mods are commonly used to assist disabled players? The most commonly mentioned type of modding came down to vision-related issues. For some, it would be a type of colorblindness. And yes, sure, 14 has colorblind modes, however, I've heard many times that a lot of games, when offering colorblind solutions, accidentally end up just making options that makes the game look exactly like it would have looked if you just actually had that type of colorblindness. Not really that helpful. Meanwhile, a more flexible, customizable mod might allow you to change the color of super specific things to highlight what you actually need to see but can't see. Some players might say that being able to do this gives an unfair advantage because the adjustment might make the mechanic or whatever it is more visible than it would be for a player without colorblindness or whatever it might be. We all have our strengths and weaknesses, and where the person with colorblindness might get this incidental slight advantage here, who knows, maybe you have an advantage somewhere else. Where this conversation gets extra weird is that it is perfectly possible that one day a boss fight is added where the express intention of the boss design is visual clutter or difficulty seeing things. Considering the accolades 14 has received in accessibility, I would find this incredibly unlikely to happen, but it could, and in that specific scenario, this kind of mod might turn from being superior assistance to some players seeing it as giving an unfair advantage. Zelania represents a fight where the poor visibility of mechanics were recognized and adjusted by the development team. Phoenix is a fight that is notorious for being difficult on vision even for players with good vision because everything is orange, and that one stands unchanged. Going a bit further on the vision track, some players might simply have worse vision outright, or alternatively may find the sheer amount of explosions and effects overwhelming, which can lead to nausea, headaches, exhaustion and whatnot. In both cases, mods that can tone down or outright remove the visual of some of the more extreme effects, or perhaps emphasize important details on the screen, help a lot. Again, without really giving the players a distinct advantage. Where things get a bit more extreme is when we move on to more physical disabilities. Someone might have an illness that causes tremors in their hands, making it difficult to perform precision movement or finding and pressing the specific action needed in time. Someone might legitimately be missing fingers or hands or an entire arm, or worse. In these cases, mods that offer things like condensing your rotation down to only a few buttons or even automating your rotation so you just have to press the button allow these players to play the game with what they have while still performing the movement necessary and, aside from the rotation, also needing to process the fight itself. What these kinds of disabilities all have in common is that while the mods they might use might give them a slight advantage over someone who isn't using them, outside of that very specific property, they are playing at a disadvantage, and these mods rarely, fully even the playing field anyway. These players are also still doing most of the necessary work of, say, a raid encounter to the same level as everyone else in the party. And importantly, where a person with all their limbs and no vision-based problems could just get good and overcome the problems these players face, there is only so much you can do entirely yourself on this if all you have is a few fingers on one hand or something like that. And that shouldn't exclude you from 14. Now, I'm sure some of you might be very confused as to why every time I list a mod and what it can do for a player with a disability, I add this angle of, it could give them advantage, you know? Is that fair? There are a few reasons for this. We're on the same team, why do you care if others use tools to help them? Indeed, mods ranging from ACT to auto rotations and even outright botting to some degree just makes the team stronger as a whole. Surely, there can't be anything wrong with that, right? Well, let's start with setting expectations. Relatively speaking, 14 job rotations are considered by a substantial amount of the player base to be pretty simple, to the degree that by the time you are savage raiding, a lot of players would expect that you're already playing your rotation at an extremely high level of accuracy. This does not apply to everyone. If, hypothetically, the reason this expectation was there was because, and note, I'm just throwing a number out there, say 50% of the savage raiding players used auto-rotation related mods to make this trivial for them. Obviously, it isn't even remotely this bad, but the effect this could have is that rotations are viewed as trivial since you can just automate them anyway, and the players that are not automating them are at a clear disadvantage and might feel like they have to use them to stay competitive. On the one hand, you and I could simply choose to not have such expectations of our fellow player, but while we can do that, other players might not be this enlightened, quote unquote. A pretty funny example of this kind of interaction is that for years now, it has been commonly known that on weeks with a patch, which tends to break things like ACT and notably Cactbot for a bit, the weekly savage reclears in Party Finder, specifically on the day of the reset where the patch dropped, tends to feature a lot of players playing significantly worse than normal. The assumption is that these players rely on Cactbot to make things easier, and indeed, the players that didn't use Cactbot are unaffected, but of course have to work a bit harder than those that do once Cactbot is back into working order. Your team playing better because of mods is nice, up to a point. For a bit of a sidetrack, in Monster Hunter, just to give an example, a somewhat uncommon problem is that public hunts, essentially the closest equivalent to Duty Finder, may sometimes be ruined by a cheater hopping in and one-shotting the monster. Sometimes this is done to grief, but some players genuinely, legitimately believe they are helping others by cheating the hunt for them, not recognizing that if these other players wanted the easy way, they could just have used the cheats themselves. Obviously, 14 modding is a much lesser version of this, but it doesn't change the fact that others using mods to make things easier for them could, in a roundabout way, negatively impact your experience, even if it mainly does so by making things easier for them. A more extreme, quote-unquote, example of this is automarkers. This automatically puts markers on players to help indicate where players need to go or what to do for a mechanic. Let's say you wanted to prog a fight like Uwu without automarkers. As the general consensus of the player base is that automarkers for Uwu is almost a requirement. Shrug. You'd need to find a full party of players that are in agreement to not use automarkers for that dream to happen, because all it takes is one person having it to help, quote-unquote, everyone. An even more extreme, and I'd almost say unheard of case of gaining advantage with mods in 14 would be to do things like increasing your character's speed or simply teleporting your character to the correct location, similar to how many of the farming bots like to do. When I said unheard of, I mean in the context of PvE content. We will be back to this one. Mods might compete with your ability to play. Whether you have a disability or not, if you feel like you have to use mods to be competitive, it may reach a point where you don't get to play the game as intended, or at least not in a way that you actually enjoy as a result. This is where the conversation becomes a bit difficult, and I want to underline that where I'm going with this topic is specifically focused on, are you enjoying the game? A player that is less experienced trying to get into harder content might find that an auto-rotation mod would massively increase their DPS, not because they couldn't reach that potential on their own, in this example, they just haven't yet. It's also possible they might already be sort of there when fighting a striking dummy, but the rotation kinda falls apart when boss mechanics happen. So automating it with a mod removes that hurdle. Again, in this example, the individual might have been able to eventually overcome this difficulty with practice. However, in the moment, simply using auto-rotation solves the problem outright and removes the need to practice anyway. Given time, they might be even more reliant on such a mod to perform because now they aren't practicing without it. To call back to the other more extreme hypothetical from before where 50% of Savage Raiders used auto-rotations, it could be the case that this individual felt compelled to use auto-rotations because it was necessary for them to stay competitive with all the others that also used it. The next step after that could be as extreme as using a mod to automate movement, since a machine made to simply follow the mechanics, if designed well enough, would move more efficiently, more consistently than a real player. And now that this individual has these optimal mods running, well, now they aren't really playing the game anymore, but they sure are performing. Just to be clear, to my knowledge, auto-rotations and automated movement in this way is not common, and 50% again was deliberately used as a huge number to make it unreal. But these kinds of hypotheticals are the kinds of fears that lead some players to push back against mods like these, even if they might help a player with a disability to be able to participate too. A more clear example of how this stuff can happen in a more common way is in playing a puzzle game. If you start needing to look up the solution to this puzzle, you might also need to look up the solution for the next one, and the next one, and the next one, because you're not getting better, you're just being handed the answer. Straight up actual cheating. While the extremes of actual straight up cheating is rare in PvE content, and the advantages mods provide typically just helps make the average player performance greater. This all works in PvE, where the opponent is a machine. When it comes to PvP, things get a lot worse. I am not myself much of a PvPer at the moment, but I do want to shine a light on this problem, as some of the tools and mods that assist in PvE content are also perfectly usable to gain an unfair advantage in PvP, where it isn't just a co-op game. The less egregious stuff, and yes I mean less, is tools that enables a player to automatically use specific actions exactly at the moment it is needed to be used. This could be a white mage using Miracle of Nature to crowd control an enemy right as they're about to pop off with their limit break, exactly frame 1. It could be a whole team landing their big attacks exactly on the frame where the target's guard goes down. Why this is less egregious is because both of these examples are, with some level of human error, perfectly possible to be done with enough experience by a real person. So it can be difficult to determine consistently who is or is not cheating here. Where it gets a lot worse is that Crystalline Conflict has, on and off for a long time at this point, had trouble with players randomly using speed hacks and no clipping. One part to gain an advantage, but in another just to troll the enemy team. A while back, there was even a stream that went on for several hours of someone using these cheats to simply walk on air over to the enemy team's spawn point. Things like that. And while I do believe they eventually got stopped, it took far too long for anyone to step in. More recently, there have been players using these tools for real matches the footage here produced by Seiren for evidence. Link to their full video in the description. It took weeks for just these individuals to be punished. The best way I can describe this is that the same freedom and flexibility that enables all of the modding and tools and plugins that the PvEing part of the player base enjoys is also, to some degree, what enables PvP players to do this. Obviously, the extreme scorched earth solution to this problem, which would be something like anti-cheat systems that would almost certainly block everything, or most things, even the completely inoffensive stuff, is not the way for 14. The game has had modding as a core part of the game experience for so many players for so long that it simply is not the way, even if I know some players genuinely think it is. The solution that would work better for everyone on the PvP angle is if there was a bit more moderation going on to prevent these problems in the first place, both in regards to the cheats, but also in regards to things like win trading, which has also been a problem here and there. When it comes to the PvE angle, I would love to say that it would be a lot easier for players to just find parties that agree on what goes and what doesn't in regards to mods, but because of the official rules in regards to mods, you can't actually discuss this very well without risking getting your account punished, so there isn't that much that could be done anyway, I feel, regardless of whether something should be done. Concluding words. When it comes to mods that give players even the slightest sniff of an advantage in combat, the conversation almost always becomes complicated, because one part of the community is fully against any and all advantages in this way, and another part believes that what others do with their individual game outright cannot negatively affect their own experience, with many varying opinions in between. The sheer extremes of perfection we, the players, sometimes seem to strive for in the game does help to explain, at least for me, why some players would be extremely against any mod that gives even the tiniest of advantage, because when it comes to theoretical optimization, such a mod might appear as mandatory for these players, who might not want to use any mod. What I think is worth remembering sometimes is that while a lot of vocal players might put forth a stance that you have to be perfect to compete, when it comes to actually playing the game, the skill of players ranges very widely, even in savage raid groups. And Dave, who lost an arm in an accident years ago, incidentally having an easier rotation than you due to a mod, probably won't really affect your chances, regardless of what it is you want to experience in the game. Besides, some players choose more complex jobs because they want to feel that challenge, so perhaps being able to automate it isn't as great as it sounds. But if it is the difference between being able to play your favorite game with your bros, or not at all, then I don't see a problem with it, as long as you are having fun. But what do you think? I would love to hear your further opinions on this topic of how mods can help, despite how controversial the topic can get. I would also, once again, thank the various individuals on my previous video on this topic for sharing their perspective, and I would like to apologize again for my poor choice of wording. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, there are mods that effectively give an advantage that could also be achieved with hardware. For example, the so-called zoom hack allows you to zoom out further, but playing on an ultra-wide monitor also grants this benefit for some reason. Similarly, actions in the game are sent on the first valid frame, meaning a higher frame rate could sometimes grant a microscopic damage gain. There are mods that can circumvent this first valid frame requirement.